Hi everybody, I hope that you're all doing well. So today, as you can see, different location. I am taking advantage of my new ring light to trial out doing some videos in front of my Christmas tree. And really this might be the only one that I do in front of the Christmas tree because we're coming up to the end of the year. And of course it is the final video of Vlogmas. It is the last video of the year, which means that I am going to be talking about the best books that I have read in 2020. Even though it's been a pretty terrible year in terms of everything that's been going on in the world and it's not been the best year personally, in terms of reading it's been pretty good. At this current moment in time I have read 120 books this year, which is just 10 less than I read last year, and I mainly attribute that to the fact that I really slowed down my reading pace towards the end of this year. Basically October, November, December have been write-offs really, but I have read some really fantastic books. A bit of a reading resolution that I had to myself was that I really wanted to try and read at least 10 books that I rated 5 stars this year, because in previous years I just find it really hard to get that excited about a book and want to rate it 5 stars, and I very quickly ended up achieving that goal like way back in June, and I think in total I've rated 15 books 5 stars this year, which is so much better than I've done in previous years. So I'm going to be honouring those fantastic books here today. I'll also link down below any reviews where I go more in detail about any of the books that I mention, as well as my best books of 2020 so far video, which I did in July. There are going to be a few books on that particular list that are not mentioned here, so if you want to get like the full immersive experience of what my 2020 was like, the best books that I read this year, definitely have a look at that too. Before we get into the main books that I read for the first time in 2020, I did want to give a little bit of a shout out to a couple of the rereads that I did this year. Now pretty much every book that I reread this year has been completely fantastic. I've absolutely loved reading them. I've reread Emma this year, I've reread The Book Thief, and both of those I thought were absolutely fantastic. However, I also read books which the first time I'd read them, maybe it wasn't that I didn't like them, but I didn't love them as much as I did now. And the two that particularly spring to mind are North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell and The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, which I'd previously read in 2019, and I think in the case of North and South I kind of didn't really like it. I think I gave it 2 stars at the time. Song of Achilles I liked but I didn't love, and now after rereading those, both of those books are 2 of my favourites of all time. So I'm not going to go too much in depth to them today because I have spoken about them previously and they are books that I originally read in 2019, but I had to give them a shout out because they have really influenced my reading this year. And now getting into the books that I read for the first time in 2020 and absolutely loved. I've got them all in a bit of a jumble on the floor right now. I'm going to mention a book that I do not currently own a copy of, but I really want to, which is The Day the World Came to Town, 9/11 in Gander, Newfoundland by Jim DeFede. This is a book that I read during non-fiction November, and it tells the true story of what happened after 9/11 when US airspace was closed, which meant that about 38 planes, I think it was, were diverted to Gander in Newfoundland, which meant that this small little town with a population of about 9,000 people suddenly had to accommodate about 7,000 or 8,000 passengers overnight. And they really stepped up to this task and showed so much kindness and compassion to these stranded passengers. If you're a musical theatre fan, you'll know this story because it is the true story that the musical Come From Away was based on. It's one of my personal favourites and I really loved reading this book. It's a book that is all about maintaining kindness and positivity in the face of so much distrust and so much tragedy. It is both uplifting but also heartbreaking both at the same time. It's a really fantastic book and I urge you all to read it, and also to go listen to the musical of course. And since I have mentioned North and South, I also wanted to mention Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. This mainly follows the story of the main character Molly Gibson, who grew up just with her father, but then as she became a teenager her father decided that she needed to have a motherly presence in her life and decided to remarry, which meant that the family dynamic was completely uprooted by the arrival of a stepmother and a new stepsister. It's a bit of a chunky boy, it's a bit of a slow burn story. There's not a lot of plot that happens in here. It's very much about the everyday events, but I love this story and I was so hooked, even though, you know, not much in terms of action happens. It's all very much contained in this one little town, but it's so charming. And because all of these characters feel so very real, I was just hooked throughout and wanting to know what happened next. None of these characters become tropes. I feel like some of them feel like they could very quickly become like the evil stepmother, the evil stepsister, but none of them do. They are all 3-dimensional, like real characters to me. This is a book that is about family and particularly the power dynamics within the family, especially in the 19th century, and how those shifting power dynamics really affect individual characters. It's a book about devotion and love. It's a book about the importance of honesty and being open. And really it is a book that is about being able to judge for yourself the differences between appearances versus reality. Absolutely brilliant. I definitely want to read more Elizabeth Gaskell in 2021. Next up we have a poetry collection. I have Somebody Give This Heart a Pen by Sophia Thakur. I feel like this is such a brilliant poetry collection and I never hear anybody else talking about it, so I had to talk about it in this video. This is a poetry collection which is about relationships. It's about carving out your identity and finding your voice, and especially trying to carve out your identity when you are a young woman in the modern world, and especially as a mixed race woman. Sophia Thakur tackles the topic of being black in Britain and particularly references Mark Duggan and Stephen Stephen Lawrence, the feelings of fear that can arise and never feeling quite stable, never feeling like you are completely accepted by the people around you, how hard it is to fully be able to carve out an identity for yourself when the people around you have differing perceptions of who you are than you do. It was a very emotional read. There's a lot of pain in her voice, but there's also this feeling of hope and of optimism. Next up is Red, White and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. This is a fun little romance story which is all about the idea of a fictional first son of America, the son of the President of the United States. What would happen if he fell in love with a Prince of England? And yeah, I read this back in I think January or August, and I've just not been able to get this out of my head. I picked this up on a day where I was feeling really down, and to be honest with you, I was feeling a little bit period crampy. I wasn't in a good place. And this was just exactly the story that I needed to perk myself back up. And yeah, as you can probably imagine, it's not super deep, and there are some British stereotypes in here and like very not subtle references to British culture. Like there are references to Bake Off and to cornettos and Jaffa cakes, which just kind of felt like they were the only British culture points that this author knew. Like she hadn't done that much research. And yeah, they did kind of leave me rolling my eyes at some points. There is a particular phrase in here that I mentioned in my wrap up, which is the phrase, "Philip broke a vase that belonged to Anne Boleyn." That line still haunts my nightmares. It keeps me awake at night. But I just thought this story was so cute and funny and just delightful. I think also what I found quite poignant reading with this is that it is set in an alternate 2020, where the 2020 election is happening. Alex's mother is the President of the United States, but she is running for re-election. And particularly because I was reading this pre the 2020 election, this was just very nice escapism, and it was nice to imagine that I was living in this world with this president rather than the American president that we currently have, but who is thankfully leaving, thank you. And I actually ended up rereading this a month after my initial read because I just wanted the story again, so I think I had to include this in my best books of 2020. And then the next book, have I mentioned how much I love Empress Matilda? No, I think I've been really quiet about it. I've never mentioned her at all. So yeah, I read Matilda, Empress Queen Warrior by Catherine Hanley back in, I think it was July, and oh, a legendary rant was made. Why do we not have a Queen Matilda on our list of monarchs? Because it got stolen from her. So begins my frustration with this entire story. No me gusta, no me gusta. I'm so annoyed. I'm so frustrated, can you tell? I'm so annoyed. This, I think, is my only non-fiction history book on this list, and it tells the story of Empress Matilda, who, after 1120 and the White Ship disaster, was the only surviving legitimate child of Henry I of England. She was therefore meant to be the heir to the throne of England. However, the men in her life had other ideas, which is why we do not have a Queen Matilda on our list of monarchs. I'm still not over it. This is the story of her life, going from right at the beginning with her birth, through her first marriage, her second marriage, and then eventually the anarchy where she is fighting for her right to the throne of England. And I just think she is such a fascinating woman, and I want to hear more people talking about this book. Something that I've mentioned quite a few times in videos is that I just loved the interrogation of the sources that Catherine Hanley did. In particular, Catherine Hanley really draws out the ways that Matilda has often been depicted by chroniclers in very gendered terms. How she would often be criticised for certain actions and certain aspects of her personality that men were routinely praised for. And even other women in her life were praised for it. It was just that they didn't seem to like her because she was fighting for the throne for herself and not for a son or for a husband. And I just love it. I want to get all of the Empress Matilda information that I can, and I really hope that one day they make some sort of drama about her life, because there is so much to unpack here. And more people need to know about this very fascinating woman of history and her life. Next up, we have Mr. Loverman by Bernardine Evaristo. This tells the story of 74-year-old Barrington Walker, who lives in Hackney in London. He is originally from Antigua, but he and his wife Carmel emigrated over to Britain during the Windrush generation. They have quite an unhappy marriage, and what Carmel does not know is that Barry has actually been in a relationship with his best friend Morris since the boys were teenagers. And it's only at this late point in his life that Barry is really trying to pluck up the courage to tell Carmel to come out to her and to divorce her so that he can spend the remaining years of his life with his true love. This book is absolutely hilarious, and a large part of that is because the character, the perspective of Barry is just so funny. He's constantly dropping different references to history and literature and different jokes. He's just a hilarious character to follow. This book is very much character focused rather than plot heavy, and it's just fantastically crafted, and I was just in complete admiration of the way that Bernardine Evaristo was able to effortlessly weave together so many different themes of language and education, immigration and feeling like you have to assimilate into a different country, and alongside that prejudices and also generational differences. How your upbringing can really affect the way that you perceive yourself and how you can try to work to break away from the negative aspects of your upbringing. I loved how through the course of this book she slowly peeled back layer by layer of these characters. You get to a point where you feel like you know these characters, you know their backstories, but then you'll get to the next chapter and a new layer will emerge and you'll just be mind blown. It's a book about how there is a lot more to people than first meets the eye, that people can be full of hypocrisy and contradictions, and that is just human nature. It was fantastic. I think it's brilliant. Everybody should read it. Next up we have My Dot Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. This is a dual timeline narrative following the character of Vanessa Y, who in the year 2000, around the age of 15-16, was groomed by her English teacher and sexually assaulted. However, we also meet her in 2017 in the light of the Me Too movement, where it is coming to light all of the allegations against her teacher because it seemed like he did this to many, many other students, not just her. She is being appealed to come forward and tell her story, but she's having a hard time with that because she's still in contact with her teacher and she still believes that the relationship that she had with this man was real love, that it was not inappropriate and that it was not assault. And as I've said many, many times, this book is absolutely haunting. And I think the main strength of this book is how well Kate Elizabeth Russell really gets you into the mindset and the perspective of young Vanessa, to the extent that I actually felt my own mood kind of slump whilst I was reading it. As Vanessa's mood went down, my mood went down, and that rarely happens in a book. I read this book in the course of one day and I was reading it kind of around my family in the living room, and I actually felt myself feeling like the secret that she was holding on to was my secret as well, and that I had something that I had to hide from my family, and it was so weird. I felt like I had to be cautious and careful of what I said to people, and it was bizarre. At the same time, like, my adult brain was very much aware that this was an inappropriate relationship. I really wanted to like jump into the pages of this book and drag her out of the situation. It was, yeah, there are so many things going on in my brain whilst I was reading this. It's not going to be a book that is for everyone, and I know there are going to be many people who might be uncomfortable reading this, and I completely understand that. Probably just use your own judgment on what you think you can handle, because it doesn't shy away from the really damaging and the abuse that she suffers. The penultimate book I'm going to talk about, or series, is the Thomas Cromwell trilogy, but I think my favourite of the three has to be The Mirror and the Light by Hilary Mantel. And no, I am still not over the Booker Prize snub of this book. I actually originally started reading this thinking I wasn't gonna like it, and in fact I had read Wolf Hall back in November 2019 and just could not get over it because I wasn't a big fan of the historical Thomas Cromwell. But then as this book was coming out, I decided I wanted to give it another go, and I was just blown away by it. Just the tremendous amount of research that has gone into this book. It is masterfully written. It just gives this incredibly atmospheric portrait of what it was like to live in Tudor England. Like I say, my favourite is the third book, The Mirror and the Light. I know a lot of people said that they had issues with the size of this because it is so much bigger than the other two books. But as I've mentioned in the past, if I love a book, I just want to keep going. I want to have as many pages as humanly possible. So that being said, if I don't like a book, then I want it to be finished as soon as possible. So you can't really win with me. But yeah, because I wanted to stay in this world, it didn't matter to me that it was so long. I would say it's got a much slower pace than the other two books. It is much more reflective and it's much less plot and action driven, which I think actually really suits this book. And it also makes the shock, if you can call it a shock because it was a historical thing that actually happened, of the last 100 pages so jarring. Very similar to what I've said previously about The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. The fact that you know what is going to happen to Thomas Cromwell, that doesn't help you at all. It doesn't stop you from feeling like you've had the rug completely pulled out from under you when you get to the final pages. And yeah, I got really emotional reading this book. I got emotional over Thomas Cromwell, which is something I never thought would happen. And then the final book on my best books of 2020 list is The Other Bennett Sister by Janice Hadlow. Oh, I love this so much. This is a retelling, a reimagining of Pride and Prejudice, but told from the perspective of the third middle child, Mary Bennett, who is described in the course of Pride and Prejudice as being the plain child, the only one of the Bennett children who is not beautiful. I feel like Jane Austen really kind of digs into Mary during the book, because not only is she described as being not beautiful, but she's also described as being like sanctimonious and not even very skilled at any of the accomplishments that she wants to be skilled at. I feel like she gets such a hard lot. And as somebody who has at points in my life felt like the Mary Bennett of my friends, of my social circle, I felt like this was so incredibly comforting to read. Mary Bennett gets the chance to really come into her own to have her moment in the sun, to really have the character growth and the happy ending that she was really not even given the chance to have in Pride and Prejudice. I know other people have disagreed with me on this point, but this book felt really, really true to all of the known characters in Pride and Prejudice. It didn't feel like distortions of them, which I felt have happened in other Pride and Prejudice retellings that I've read. It's the characters that you know and love, but you're just looking at them from a different angle and from a different perspective, transplanting the narrative away from Elizabeth and from Darcy and plopping us into the perspective of Mary and how our views of these characters change when we see them from Mary's point of view. I know for some people they took issue with the portrayal of Charlotte Lucas, which didn't really bother me. I felt like it did feel like something that Charlotte could or might have done, you know, depending on the situation. But then also I read Charlotte by Helen Moffat this year, so I feel like I was quite well catered to my like Charlotte Lucas fix. So even if I would have had any gripes with the portrayal of her in this, I felt like I'm good. I feel like Charlotte does well in other Pride and Prejudice retellings, if that makes any sense. And what I like about this is that it doesn't lie in the original story of Pride and Prejudice for too long. It actually expands upon it and tells the story of Mary's life after Mr. Bennett dies and after Mary has to make her own way in the world. I love the fact that this story takes us back to the Gardeners, who in my opinion are the unsung heroes of Pride and Prejudice. There are so many lovely little references and tributes to Jane Austen's books, not just Pride and Prejudice but others as well throughout this book. It felt like a love letter to Jane Austen. I especially picked up on some Emma references, especially towards the end of this book, which just made my little heart soar. Once again, a book that, because it is a little bit longer, it's about 650 pages or so, I feel like other people have said is a little bit too long, but when I like a book, I want it to be as long as humanly possible. I feel like for some people, they'd get halfway through this book and feel like, oh, I've still got 300 pages to go, but I got to the middle of this book and I was like, oh, I've still got 300 pages to gobble up, yay! I think I read this back in February and it brightened my dreary February days so well. I definitely need to reread this at some point and I highly recommend it. I've heard also that they might be doing a BBC television series of this, or maybe a movie of this, and I am so hyped for that. And if you want to cast me as any character in this, then I have no agent, I'm not a professional actress, but I'll do it. So yes, those were all of my favourite books of 2020 that I wanted to talk to you about today. Do let me know any of your favourite books of 2020 and what you thought about any of the books that I mentioned today. I want to wish you a happy new year. Thank you so much for making my first year of BookTube so incredibly special. I hope you're all doing really well and I look forward to talking to you in 2021. Thanks. Bye!